I worked the night desk at a hospital in Stockholm, and last month, an American woman walked in holding her arm at a strange angle. She'd slipped on ice outside her hotel, clearly fractured something, and looked terrified, but not from the pain. She kept asking where to register her insurance before anyone would look at her. The triage nurse walked her straight back to X-ray. The woman actually planted her feet and refused to move until someone ran her credit card, insisting she knew how emergency rooms worked, and there had to be a payment desk somewhere. She said her insurance had a high deductible and she needed to know if this would cost $8,000 or $12,000, so she could decide whether to get the arm set or just wrap it herself at the hotel. The nurse told her it was free. The woman accused us of lying to get her into debt and said she'd read about medical bankruptcy and wasn't going to fall for it. She made us show her the government website on her phone before she'd let anyone touch her arm. My cousin manages a pharmacy in Oslo. An American guy came in demanding the strongest painkillers they had because he refused to waste money on a doctor visit for his infected leg. He'd been treating it himself for 5 days with stuff he bought at a grocery store. My cousin took one look at the leg, turned gray, and called an ambulance over the guy's screaming objections. The American was yelling that an ambulance in the States costs more than a used car and he'd rather Uber to the airport and fly home than pay Norwegian ambulance rates. He tried to physically stop my cousin from making the call. The ambulance showed up, treated him on site, took him to the hospital, they cleaned the wound, and gave him 4 antibiotics, kept him overnight for observation, sent him home with prescriptions, and the total bill was $0. He spent his last day in Oslo walking around to tourist spots asking random Norwegians if they were pranking him. My sister works reception at a medical clinic in Wellington, and an American family showed up with their son who'd fallen off a bike and clearly broken his collarbone. The father handed over his passport and 3 different credit cards before my sister could say anything, announced he understood they'd need a deposit, and asked if $4,000 would cover it or if they needed more. My sister said the visit would be bulk, billed, and free. The mother started crying. Not from relief, but because she was convinced we were running some kind of scam where we'd say it's free and then send them a bill for $50,000 6 months later when they couldn't dispute it. She said she'd seen this trick on American news. I'm a medical translator in Tokyo. Last week I worked with an American tourist who'd collapsed from dehydration at a temple. The EMTs brought him in, and he woke up in the ER hooked to an IV, and his first words were asking who he should sue because he never consented to treatment and wouldn't be able to pay for it. He announced he'd looked up Japanese law and knew they couldn't force medical care on someone without permission. So everything they'd done was illegal, and he didn't know anything. The doctor explained they'd saved his life, and he should rest. The man demanded to know the price per bag of saline, the cost per minute of 4 insertion, and whether the ambulance charged by distance or time. He pulled out his phone and started comparing prices to American hospitals, nodding along like this confirmed something. When the bill came to 8,000 yen, about $50, he asked if that was per hour. The doctor said that was total. The man asked to see an itemized receipt because that couldn't possibly include the ambulance. The error room, 3 bags of saline, the 4 equipment, and 2 hours of monitoring. He spent his recovery time trying to figure out what hidden fees would hit his credit card later. My brother works emergency intake in Copenhagen, and an American woman arrived with chest pains, very clearly having a heart attack. She was clutching her purse and wouldn't let go long enough for the staff to get her on a gurney. She kept saying she needed to call her insurance company first to get authorization, or they wouldn't cover it. Well, and could someone please just tell her if this hospital was a network? My brother explained there was no network, and this was a medical emergency. The woman said that was exactly what American hospitals said before they charged you $30,000 for an aspirin. She tried to leave to find an in-network hospital. And when my brother explained every hospital in Denmark operates the same way, she asked if she could just get the name of the specific doctor who'd treat her so she could verify his credentials online first. She said back home, you had to make sure your emergency room doctor was covered separately from the hospital itself. And she wasn't about to get caught by that scam in a foreign country. They had to restrain her gently while explaining she was actively dying. She spent her first day of recovery asking every nurse whether it did mark billed separately for each medical professional who touched you. I worked the registration desk at a public hospital in Berlin. An American man walked in with his teenage daughter who'd sprained her ankle badly at a museum. He was already shouting before he reached my desk, announcing he'd been to a German hospital before and knew. They charged different rates for tourists, and he wanted the same price Germans got. He said he'd looked it up and knew Germany had universal healthcare, but that only applied to Germans. Tourists got charged triple. I told him the price was the same and treatment was free. He said he wanted that in writing because he'd heard about European hospitals that verbally told you one price and then charged another. His daughter was crying, not from pain, but from embarrassment. He made me print out the hospital's billing policy in English, highlight the section about emergency care, and sign my name at the bottom before he'd let anyone examine her. After they x-rayed the ankle, gave her a boot, and sent them home with painkillers. The bill was $0. He stood at my desk for 20 minutes, demanding to know when the real bill would arrive. I told him there was no bill. He said he'd wait. He literally sat in the lobby for an hour, convinced someone would come out with an invoice. My uncle runs a small urgent care clinic in Brussels, and an American couple came in because the wife had cut her hand badly opening a wine bottle at their hotel. She was bleeding through a towel, but refused to unwrap it until they discussed payment options. The husband asked if they accepted payment plans because they had already spent their emergency fund on the trip. My uncle told them to sit down and started cleaning the wound. The husband physically put himself between my uncle and his wife, saying they needed to agree on a price first because back home his wife had gotten stitches and the bill was $4,000. And they couldn't afford that in Belgium on top of what they'd already paid for the vacation. My uncle said the stitches would be free. The wife said there was no such thing as free medical care, and she'd rather superglue the cut herself than end up in collections. The husband said they were both teachers and couldn't risk their credit scores. My uncle had to show them the government website on his phone before they'd let him touch the cut. After he stitched her up and bandaged it, the bill was €60. The husband asked if that was the copay or the total. My uncle said total. The wife started laughing and then crying and couldn't stop for 5 minutes. I manage a clinic in Auckland, and an American woman called from her hotel asking what our cheapest x-ray option was because she thought she'd cracked a rib but didn't want to waste money if it was just bruised. She asked if we had a payment plan option or if she could just pay for the doctor to look at it without any equipment because equipment was always the expensive part. I told her to come in and we'd figure it out. She showed up with her husband and they'd clearly argued about this on the way. She kept saying she was fine and they should save the money. And he kept saying she couldn't breathe properly and they had to get it checked. She made him promise before walking in that if the x-ray was going to cost more than $500, they'd leave and she'd just rest for a few weeks instead. The receptionist told her the x-ray was free. The woman said she wanted to know the real price, not the price with insurance, because she didn't have international coverage. The receptionist repeated it was free for everyone. The woman asked to speak to a supervisor because she felt like people weren't taking her seriously. After we x-rayed her, confirmed to cracked ribs, wrapped her chest, and gave her pain medication. The bill was $40 for the prescription. She asked 3 times if we'd accidentally left off the x-ray charge. Her husband paid and then sat in his car in the parking lot for 30 minutes staring at the receipt. My sister-in-law works at a walk-in clinic in Dublin, and an American man came in with a badly infected tooth. One side of his face swollen up like a balloon. He was in so much pain he could barely talk. But he managed to ask whether Ireland did medical tourism and if dental work was cheaper here than in America. My sister-in-law said he needed to see a dentist immediately because that infection could spread to his brain. The man said he'd looked into dental tourism before his trip and knew Ireland wasn't one of the cheap countries. So he'd just wait until he got home and go to Mexico like he'd originally planned. She told him he couldn't wait 2 weeks with an infection that's severe. He said American dental work costs thousands of dollars, and he'd already priced it out, and Mexico was $600 for the same procedure. So Ireland probably split the difference, and he couldn't afford $1,500 right now. She had to call an emergency dentist while he protested. The dentist saw him within an hour, drained the abscess, prescribed antibiotics, and charged him €80. The man asked if that was just the consultation, or if it included the actual draining. The dentist said it was everything. The man asked 3 more times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding the currency conversion. I work intake at a children's hospital in Montreal. American parents brought in their toddler who'd been running a dangerously high fever for 2 days. They'd been treating him with children's medicine from a pharmacy, but it wasn't working, and the kid was getting worse. The father told me they'd debated going to the hospital for 48 hours because they didn't have travel insurance, and knew a pediatric ER visit in the States could cost $10,000. He said they'd almost gotten on a plane home, so they could at least use their regular insurance. But the kid's fever hit 40 degrees, and they panicked. The mother was crying and asking if we needed a deposit and how much time they had to pay, because they'd have to put it on a credit card and make payments. I told them to follow me back immediately, and we'd worry about payment later. The father said he appreciated that, but he needed a dollar amount right now, even an estimate, because his credit limit was $15,000, and he had to know if this would max it out. I kept walking and told them treatment came first. They admitted the child, ran tests, diagnosed an aggressive bacterial infection, started for antibiotics, and kept him for 2 nights. The total bill was $0. The parents thought I was telling them the bill hadn't been calculated yet. I had to walk them to billing and have a supervisor explain Canadian healthcare to them. They left the hospital and sat in their rental car crying for 20 minutes. I'm an emergency room nurse in Sydney, and an American teenager came in alone. Brought by a friend's parent because he'd broken his finger playing basketball and was too scared to tell his own parents. He kept saying his dad would kill him for wasting money on an emergency room visit for something minor. The friend's mother tried to reassure him it wouldn't be expensive. The kid said his dad had told him before the trip that if anything happened, he should just wrap it and wait until they got home because American insurance didn't work in Australia and they'd have to pay cash rates. He was nearly in tears, not from his crooked finger, but from fear of the bill. Asked if we could just give him a splint without doing an x-ray because x-rays were always the expensive part and his finger would heal on its own anyway. I told him we needed to x-ray to make sure it healed properly. He asked how much that would cost, and when I said it was free, he asked if I meant free with insurance. Said free for everyone. He asked if that included Americans, and I said yes. After we x-rayed it, confirmed a clean break, set it, and splinted it, the bill was $0. The kid asked if his parents would get a bill at home, and I said no. He made me promise twice. When his parents picked him up, he immediately started apologizing for costing them so much money, and the friend's mother had to explain he hadn't cost them anything. His father didn't believe it and went to the billing desk to confirm. I'm a paramedic in Edinburgh, and we responded to a call for an American tourist who'd had an allergic reaction to something she ate. She was wheezing badly, her throat was swelling, and she needed an EpiPen immediately. Her husband was standing over her yelling at us not to use the EpiPen because each one cost $600 in America, and their insurance might not cover it, since they were out of the country. He said she'd had reactions before, and usually they went away on their own if she just waited long enough. My partner explained she could die, and the husband said he understood that. But could we just give her Benadryl first and see if that worked because the EpiPen was a last resort due to the cost? He was blocking us from reaching her. We had to physically move him aside and administer the epinephrine. The wife recovered in the ambulance. The husband spent the entire ride asking how much everything cost. The ambulance ride, the EpiPen, the oxygen, the monitoring equipment. He had his phone out trying to calculate whether this trip was still worth it financially, or if they should have just stayed home. When we dropped them at the hospital and told them there was no charge for the ambulance, he accused us of lying because he'd Googled Scottish ambulance prices before the trip and knew they cost money. I had to explain that tourists don't get charged for emergency services. He asked for that in writing. My cousin drives an ambulance in Vienna, and they picked up an American man who'd collapsed while climbing stairs to a church. He was conscious, but disoriented, and possibly having a stroke. His wife was with him, and she spent the entire ambulance ride apologizing to my cousin for wasting their time and saying they couldn't afford an ambulance, but didn't know what else to do. She asked if they could just drop him at the emergency room entrance, instead of bringing him inside because she'd heard that if the ambulance crew handed you off to ER staff, triggered an automatic charge of $3,000. My cousin told her to stop worrying about money and focus on her husband. She said she was focused on her husband, which was why she was worried about money, because if they went into debt over this, they'd never recover financially. She had their passports out and was trying to calculate whether Austrian medical debt would follow them back to America. Her husband was barely responsive, and she was Googling international collections agencies. After they treated him for a minor stroke, kept him for observation, did an MRI, and sent him home with medication. The bill was minimal, the wife asked the hospital administrator if Austria offered medical bankruptcy and what the process was. The administrator had no idea what she was talking about. I worked the dispatch desk for emergency services in Reykjavik, and an American woman called saying her husband was having severe chest pain and shortness of breath, clearly describing a heart attack. But she wanted to know the cost of an ambulance before she committed to calling one. I told her to give me the address and we'd send help immediately. She said she needed a price first because they'd already spent most of their trip budget, and an ambulance in America costs $2,000 minimum. So if Iceland charged the same rate, she'd just drive him to the hospital herself. I told her we don't charge for ambulances. She said everyone charges for ambulances, and she'd looked this up before traveling. She asked if I meant we don't charge Icelandic citizens, but do charge tourists, and I said we don't charge anyone. She said that didn't make sense and asked what the catch was, because there was always a catch with medical billing. While she was arguing with me, her husband was gasping in the background. I sent the ambulance to her location without her permission, and when they arrived, she tried to refuse service because she hadn't agreed to the cost yet. The paramedics explained there was no cost, loaded him into the ambulance, and saved his life. She spent his entire recovery asking hospital staff to explain exactly how Iceland pays for emergency services, because she was convinced they'd find a way to bill her eventually. I'm a dispatcher in Lisbon. An American tourist called because her friend had fallen and hit her head and wasn't waking up properly. The caller was panicking but kept interrupting herself to ask about payment. She said they were both students and didn't have much money, and she needed to know if Portugal had payment plans for tourists or if they'd have to use a credit card for the whole amount. I told her we were sending an ambulance immediately and to stay with her friend. She said she appreciated that but really needed a cost estimate because her friend's parents would want to know, and they'd specifically told their daughter not to do anything expensive while traveling. I asked if her friend was breathing normally, and she said yes, but sluggishly, and then asked if the ambulance charge was based on distance or time because she could try to carry her friend closer to the hospital if that would make it cheaper. I told her to stay where she was and wait for the ambulance. After they treated her friend for a concussion, did a CT scan, and kept her overnight for observation. The bill was under €200. The American student called her friends, parents crying not because of the injury, but because she'd been so terrified of bankrupting them over a medical emergency. The parents asked if she was joking about the price. I'm a taxi driver in Prague, and I picked up an American couple from the airport who'd just arrived and immediately needed to go to a hospital because the wife had been feeling chest pains on the plane. She thought it was just anxiety from flying, but her husband insisted they get it checked. In the cab, they were arguing about whether they should go to the hospital or just go to their hotel and see how she felt in a few hours, the wife said. If it was serious enough for a hospital, they should fly back home immediately and deal with it there where their insurance worked. The husband said if it was a heart attack, she couldn't fly, and they needed to make sure she was okay first. They asked me which Prague hospital was cheapest for tourists.